you turn it off, you don't actually turn it off. This is one of those things that's kind of wild, but when you shut down a nuclear reactor, you're actually still producing heat, but you have to be able to have a system that can cool and remove that heat. And that's typically been the biggest challenge in the headline events that you talked about. You can accommodate and achieve that using natural phenomena as well.
Welcome to the Emergent podcast, where we interview product and startup leaders from emerging technology companies about their work in the trenches to bring the hardest and most impactful technologies to life. Today's guest is Jacob DeWitte. Jacob is the co-founder and CEO of Oklo, a Santa Clara-based company developing advanced nuclear reactors that went public through Sam Altman's SPAC earlier this year. Jacob has experience working on a variety of advanced reactor designs, including sodium fast reactors, molten salt reactors, and next-generation pressurized water reactors, as well as the nuclear fuel cycle and analysis. Jacob also worked with experimental irradiation testing facilities, and he's originally from Albuquerque, New Mexico. He earned his BS in nuclear engineering from the University of Florida and his Master's of Science and PhD in nuclear engineering, both at MIT. In this episode, we discuss the importance of nuclear energy in our planet's fight to produce enough energy for mankind for the next billion years. We dive deep into how Oklo's Aurora reactors work, what went wrong in historical meltdowns, and how Oklo has engineered their nuclear reactors to avoid these pitfalls. We discuss how to retain investor confidence while building a startup that takes a decade plus to commercialize, recycling of radioactive nuclear waste, which, spoiler, can power the planet long into the future, AI data centers and their new demands on the grid, and what it looks like to press the industry forward in one of the toughest regulatory environments in existence. We talk about Oklo's decision to go public via SPAC, competition in the nuclear industry, and where the future is taking this exciting technology. Now a word from our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by FlyKit, FLYKITT, the first full solution to jet lag. This might seem hard to believe, but I've flown from Los Angeles to Tokyo and back with virtually no jet lag using FlyKit. Based on research with Navy SEALs and fighter pilots, the FlyKit team discovered that long flights cause inflammation in addition to disrupting your circadian rhythm. And they figured out how to solve both these challenges using a customized program for when to eat, sleep, and use their patented supplements and blue light blocking glasses. It's simple to follow, and you don't have to change anything before your travel day. With FlyKit, more than 90% of people can sleep well in Europe, Asia, or anywhere else in the world on night one. Visit flykit.com and use coupon code FLYWITHEMERGENT to get 15% off FlyKit. I am pumped to be discussing nuclear energy with you. I'm so excited about the fact that, nuclear energy is producing millions of times more output per atom than combustion. And I think as you're aware, a long time ago in my career, I did some of this work as an intern at Lawrence Livermore, but on the weapons side, and then worked in non-proliferation. So I'm really stoked to have you today, Jacob. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. It's kind of fun too, because my background was starting actually in the weapons side. As my first kind of gig, I guess, was an internship at Sandia National Lab. So eager to jump in.
I love it. At some point, we'll have to have a classified version of the podcast where we can talk about nuclear weapons technologies.
That would be an interesting one.
Yeah, right. I don't know how that would work. Well, let's set the stage at a high level. For people who are unfamiliar with the relative benefits and risks of nuclear technology, can you explain why Oklo's mission is so important to the planet?
Yeah, I mean, this gets to what you said in the intro, right? Which is energy density. And the fact that you can unlock all of that energy without having emissions that come out from it that are climate contributing, right? So you don't have greenhouse gas emissions. It gives you two huge benefits that kind of come from that. Obviously, there's the sustainability piece from an emissions perspective and from a climate perspective, but there's also this phenomenal benefit of just a general resource scalability and sustainability perspective. One thing that's sort of follows on the incredible energy density of fission, right? And just to put kind of some fun numbers on it, when you split an atom, you're typically releasing about 50 million times more energy than a typical kind of combustion oxidation reaction. That's insane, right? And that means you need a lot less material, obviously, to get energy from it. But to kind of extrapolate that, one of the interesting things that is also nice about fission is it makes heat in a fairly, I'll call it this, and this is a little bit reductionist, but a fairly easy to use form of heat. Sounds funny, I know, but what that means is, right, at the end of the day, what a nuclear reactor generally is a water boiler, in some form, right? And at the end of the day, you're making heat that's being transferred through media to go boil water. And the heat from fission in fuel is ultimately, heat energy from fission is mostly manifest as heat in the fuel that is then, typically conducted out of the fuel and then convectively carried away by the coolant. Um, all of that translates into a system that can be engineered to harness all of that incredible energy density in a very materially, I would call it, efficient way. And what that means is not only is the fuel very energy dense, but actually the amount of materials you need to make each megawatt hour of energy from a fission power plant is actually the fewest of all energy sources. That's kind of an awkward way of saying nuclear fission requires a much smaller bill of materials to make each megawatt hour of energy it produces compared to all other energy sources out there, which is a pretty fantastic advantage to have because that gives you massive scalability benefits and also sustainability benefits. And also should obviously translate also to significant economic benefits. So all around, it's a pretty promising approach to give you really scalable, abundant energy, and do so in a sustainable way. And then kind of put all that together. Then the other number I like to add in is from like a true scalability perspective, because the energy density is so high and the materials needed, so the heavy metals you use as fuel in these systems are actually relatively, I guess I'd say relatively abundant. There's enough energy content in those materials that with advanced technologies like fast reactors, like what we're doing, and advanced recycling techniques that allow you to keep reusing unused parts of fuel, you can actually power the entire planet's energy needs for billions of years, right? Effectively the durable lifetime of the planet or the inhabitable lifetime of the planet. So this is a terminal energy climate solution that we know works.
True definition of sustainable, right? Like
Yeah,
that's what sustainable is actually supposed to mean in this context. Yeah,
exactly.
interesting. Is there a theoretical maximum sort of velocity of power production given that you're ultimately still just boiling water, but you're just boiling it with a much better source? Because the water boils at 212 and that's it, right? So how does that work?
Yeah. So the way this all translates is the laws of thermodynamics dictate how much energy we can actually convert from one form to the other, dealing with all the various loss factors that have to account for what thermodynamics dictates to us. In other words, the heat you make in a reactor, the actual energy made in the reactor that takes the form of heat. So the joules, if you will, or the megawatt hours, if you will, of in the thermal terms, you can only convert so much of that into electric energy. And that's going to be dictated by just the actual thermodynamic sort of limits and efficiencies of the turbines or the technologies used to convert that electricity. It's there are promising alternatives to that might be more efficient at these temperatures in converting the energy from heat energy into electric energy. But steam systems are just the best. But the thing is, I mean, they're the most mature technology. They just work at a better advantage state now. But there might be things that come in the future that have some more efficiency around them. That said, the technology is just very immature. But to get to that point, like how that actually works, right, is you build up a system that you're running the steam at actually at a higher operating temperature. So you're running at a higher temperature, higher pressure, and that means it's a pressurized system on the power conversion side, just like you see in gas boilers and solar thermal boilers and coal boilers. It's very similar. Each one is obviously tailored to the different considerations there, but in a nuclear system, you're going to be operating in a range that can be on the lower end to the higher end there, depending on the technology type. And then you're just heating up that water with the energy that's transferred to it, probably by another coolant, sometimes directly from the fuel, to then boil it, make the steam to then spin a turbine. So I'd say that like the nice thing about this is a deeply mature technology that can scale rapidly, right? Like we're definitely not limited and bottlenecked by turbine availability, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
And in terms of like physical maneuvering of power production, there are thermal time constants in a system across the board. Those are actually features though in general, because, having really fast responses, to the grid, that's like important that you can get from like batteries, but spinning turbines provide a lot of sort of shock absorption to the grid system. So, to kind of pull in the thread you said about velocity, That's actually a huge benefit about having spinning turbo machinery in terms of being a shock absorber to the grid with all the sort of voltage dynamics that happen. And yeah, the grid is an incredibly complex system that's wild to think about how well it operates considering all the challenges and constraints it has. But these are important assets actually in terms of that, right? Not just the power they produce, but also sort of the reactive power held by having all this sort of spinning inertia and a big turbine set.
Interesting, interesting. So, a lot of founders with really big ideas like this, they're paralyzed to act because they're not sure how they're going to build something that, in the case of Oklo, requires a decade plus and a massive amount of capital before it can be put into practice. How have you navigated showing intermediate progress, earning revenue, all these things before your Aurora reactor is, fully available on the open market?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is one of those things where if you have a big view, big vision, big idea, you kind of have to think about what it is you want to get to. And then I think work backwards from there to some degree about the likely path to get there. And then iterate to go back forward and say, okay, if I come to this conclusion and then I start executing on this, how do I make sure I'm getting closer and closer towards the goal of where I want to get to? And be flexible. I think that's one of the hardest things is because it's always going to be radically different, right? Like what you envision, like at the earliest days of before you start something to when you start something, the actual roadmap and the path is pretty much always going to be different than what it actually, then like the real path is actually going to be different than what you thought. I think for me, this is one of those things where for this side of things, like the first principles are just so heavily on your side. Like the physics are just so heavily on your side. Better energy source, more scalable, known mature technology. And in a world where despite some of the like I remember back before we started the company in 2013 or around that time, we go to like the MIT Energy Conference and you hear one sort of like panel talking about how energy demand is flat and going to be flat or maybe declining. But then you hear the very next panel or even a panel contemporaneously, maybe that was the problem, it was contemporaneous, was oh my gosh, we're going to need so much more energy if we're going to drive electrification and all these things from transit to, home heating, cooking, all this stuff. And you're like, yeah, okay, I'm going to bet on that latter because like I don't think humans have ever gone to using less energy, right? So if you have a better source of doing it with the technology works, despite some perhaps optical things, I think those are actually the ideal considerations around starting a company when it's somewhat contrarian in that sense, because some things, well, there are some things that are definitely harder, but I think in some of the ways, some of the macros are easier. But that's because you have sort of the inertia behind you, the physics is sort of the first principles on your side. So I think that was what we set out for, and definitely had a long-term vision and had sort of sweeping iterations about what we thought was going to be the case, and then just dove in with sort of the most meaningful incremental step possible. And I think that's the thing that's hard is if you chase everything, it's just too hard. If you go after kind of a niche angle of how you get your toe in the water, so to speak, that's, I think, a great way to start. And then, but be flexible, right? Because that might not be the best answer and you kind of have to iterate from there. But if you at least do that, that's, I think, how you take that first step, because sometimes taking the first step can be the hardest if you feel like that first step is super, super far. But if you kind of just like stumble into it because you're leaning into it pretty hard, like that makes that first step a lot easier.
Yeah, yeah, but help me decompose what was the first step for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, what we thought was sort of the thesis for what we're doing at Oklo largely came from watching and being part of an industry that, first of all, so my background, I grew up in New Mexico, fell in love with the technology at a young age. Obviously, got the chance to kind of get started on it from a kind of unique lens, actually, a unique angle from the weapon side to start. But that gave me a good platform to springboard into sort of the science, the physics, the engineered systems of it, with a focus then on the power generation side across a lot of different facets of the industry. So I spent time in the national labs and some of the industrial players on the fuel cycle, to the reactor designers and academia. The thing I got into though is thinking, okay, new technologies are going to be what drive forward. Because to me, it was always like, man, nuclear is just inevitable. It has too many reasons to not be. And then I thought what ushered in sort of the new waves, because we have all these plants built, it's amazing, but the new waves of growth that I thought were inevitable were going to be driven by new technologies. What I quickly learned though was that actually that's maybe part of the equation. The real challenges, though, I thought were around the stagnation of the industry at large. And there's a lot of drivers that made that happen. I think there's a couple things that kind of, you can point to. But we saw, hey, like we haven't innovated on the business model side in nuclear, maybe ever, or at least in decades. We were still stuck in the same model of designing a power plant to partial completion. Like this is what a company like ours would boilerplate look like. You design a reactor and a power plant somewhere between 50 and 80% completion. Take those incomplete blueprints, go ask people to pay you a couple $100 million to then take it over, do the rest of the design work side, permanent build it themselves, just massively burdensome and puts a lot of friction on the customer. So it makes basically buying nuclear systems really hard. So our view was, why don't we make it easier there? And then the other part was couple that then with a couple other factors. So we found that there's a lot of interest if we actually made it easier to buy the power by just designing and operating the systems and selling the power through power purchase agreements or similar vehicles. Then the other part was to then start at a smaller size so that we could actually be economically more attractive from a total capital needs side. If you start a company needing billions of dollars to go from start to first product, that's a really hard thing to solve for. If you can incrementalize that into small but meaningful chunks, that's worth a lot. Our view was start as small as you reasonably could, not so small that it's a toy, not so small that you're building a diversion of what you're really trying to do, like a non-power reactor or all these other things. I think that's actually a distraction. But what's the smallest meaningful increment you can take? And we found that to be what ended up at 15 megawatts as an initial entry point. And that allows us to reduce the total capital requirements. But there's also benefits from an organizational perspective. If you have to build, one, I think, massively hard thing that hard tech companies tend to do is they way overhire. I think some of that's afforded by sometimes too much easy and abundant capital early on, a lack of cultural perspective that keeps you focused on cost discipline, and or kind of a view that you have to be very, very you just have to have staffing to meet certain goals to move quickly. When I would argue that's actually, you can really invert a lot of those paradigms, but it does mean you have to be very deliberate and intentional. But then that positions you to have much more capital efficiency. And being smaller means it's easier to sort of taking a smaller bite, right? Allows you to more efficiently kind of tackle that opportunity with a team that can understand the whole system, across multiple individuals, each understanding the whole system. That's worth a lot from systems engineering and systems organization and integration perspectives from team building. If you have a system so complex, you need a lot of people to just be able to have expertise, multiple people in a room to have expertise on the whole system. That's I think a hard thing to do. You can definitely do it, but that's a really hard thing to build a company from scratch to be able to do.
But what did you, this all makes sense, but you're in year 7, you're in year 8, you're in year 9, and you're briefing the investors on the progress that you've made. But you don't yet have a full Aurora plant, pushing power out today. What did you show that? Because you've talked about staying on the critical path, but what did you end up showing? What were, to the extent that you're willing to discuss any of those milestones, what are 1 or 2 of those interesting milestones on that complex journey?
I think this gets back to being intentional about how you tackle risk. I think, we weren't taking on technical risk, right? And that's kind of the next pillar here. We design, business model, size, and then the technology choice. One thing nice about the nuclear side was we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We could, but we don't have to. And maybe I should say it differently. We don't have to invent a new wheel. We already have wheels that work. We're building out from mature technology. It has a long history of operational excellence behind it. A lot of the learnings came before, thanks to government research and development investments spanning decades before. That's a fantastic platform to be able to build off of. If, as a result, that takes a lot of the elements around, I would say, certain risk elements off the table and allows you to then focus on different milestones. Now, interestingly, if you want to hack VC, if that's your goal, and I don't think that's aligned to actually building a business in the best way, then you might want to do not that. You might want to do something that's very new and different so that you can point to all of this kind of hardware testing and development, but you're going to be driving that in a manner that ultimately is deferring product development. And arguably, especially in a space like nuclear, I would argue that a lot of the really good ideas have already been tested and explored to a pretty high degree. There's been some technological progress in certain areas that maybe warrant looking or brushing off some of those ideas and looking at them again, but I think most of that work's already been done. So starting fresh and anew and trying to do something really novel to then build a little test stand, non-nuclear, but a little test stand to show some phenomena, and then build a little bigger one and just kind of march on that. That's definitely an easy way to tell investors that you're making progress. What might be lost in that, though, is you're taking this really circuitous long path as opposed to taking a direct path right to market and being efficient on that. So for us, what that looked like was, okay, we built this framework, and then it's just a matter of execution. We knew what we have to do, right? Is you have to build a customer order book. That was a key thing we wanted to show as validation of the business model, and then also market discovery and exploration. Make sure you find some things. You're finding some people who really love what you're doing. Then on top of that, use that to sort of better understand the unit economics, which is something that too often I think gets lost in early startups, but really understand like, okay, this does work, this does refine out. And then make the right progress in terms of supply chain development and regulatory development in the right phases. And since there's so much regulatory overhang in the space, there's a lot of opportunity to kind of drive into that very early. And then you're able to lay out a roadmap and a plan, communicate that, and then execute against it, right? So you have all these milestones that you kind of set the goals, set the stage with that you can then execute against and then iterate upon as you find that maybe some of those weren't the best or the right ones. Some are more important in different orders, perhaps. So I think that's what we try to set the stage to do was like, all right, tackle these things in the right staging, the right order, but make sure people understand that this is a long game. We see a path to be very aggressive on the time and perhaps really, really, really do some things in crazy fast ways, but also make sure people understand there's risk that might compound in these different areas so that if we thought we could produce a plant in year X, it might actually slip by 1 or 2 years based on the progress through these points. It doesn't change the overall value of what we're trying to do by focusing on many. And that was another big thing here that I think we tried to focus on was this isn't about building one plant. If you make it all about that, you're inevitably, I think, actually in a bad spot to succeed because everything gets fixated on what happens with that one plant. Our view is more like, hey, this stuff's been built before. We're just modernizing it and we're trying to pump as many out the door as quickly as we can. So it's really about the volume and the time it takes to get to volume and walk our way into that. And that's kind of what we, really wanted to focus on. So I think like the first steps were really leaning into talking to customers and we're laying out a path to actually take this thing to market that included finance and regulatory milestones, and then start executing on those and then just dynamically iterate.
Yeah. So you pointed to a lot of historical trust points, your own experience, and you said, this is the path. These are the things that are actually not risky. Like, let us focus on these parts that are very difficult, but not, technology risky from the standpoint of, hey, no one has ever done a thing like this before, but maybe bringing the pieces together like this is the thing that no one's ever done before. That's kind of the insight there for how to stay on strategy without making these detours.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like, hey, if we can build more, I mean, what we saw in this space, right, is we have a technology set we know works. We obviously have to kind of optimize the design for our use case with a bunch of known things, and we know how to simulate, model, and test those things. And we don't have to do a lot of the testing because it's already been done. And then bring that forward and make sure that then that's tied with the actual then path to market. Because that's the key thing is you have to integrate all those pieces and just constantly kind of sweep through those, share updates. I think the hardest thing about a journey like this is a lot of things become qualitative. They're not exactly quantitative. And that's where, there is some interesting challenges there, but that's where like qualitatively speaking, optics, and this can be the detour that presents itself is fun. So you could go build a test stand that proves out something that doesn't actually prove out anything. It's like, oh, look, I can heat something up and the heat gets removed. Like to be a little reductionist, but it's like, okay, what's the point? Like, what did that really show you? Right. And in some cases, yeah, you can definitely do things that are meaningful on that. Other times it's honestly mostly just, it's a dog and pony show. But that can be a big distraction. It can also be useful, and I totally respect that. Let's be real about what it takes to actually to build a business in a space. You do have to kind of be mindful about optical considerations and in playing to the market. But I do think sometimes there's a tendency to over hack like venture capital perspectives and frankly naivete accordingly, and that just ends up becoming a distraction at some point.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great to hear a founder owning the narrative, even in the face of the VCs. Um, okay, so let's get safety out of the way, and I kind of want to nerd out here a little bit on meltdowns. So the general public obviously has not been able to completely shake the nuclear accidents at 3 Mile Island, awareness of Chernobyl and Fukushima and other countries. Um, and Oklo is trying to dramatically increase the number of reactors, in our backyard, so to speak. And I saw on your site there were some interesting experiments that had been run in the 60s where the reactor sort of cooled itself down naturally. And I was hoping that you could kind of unpack how this technology works for us, what you guys are leveraging. Like, what happens in a normal meltdown? Why do those circumstances not even exist in an Aurora reactor? And how have you guys hacked this challenge?
No, I think that's a great question, and I think this is one of the key things that's also pretty under appreciated about what you can do on the nuclear technology side. When I talk about physics being on your side, it's not just because it's materially dense and all these other things. It's actually because these are systems that can be tightly integrated from a multi-physics perspective and actually be inherently safe systems, right? They're self-controlling, self-cooling systems. And you can do that with a number of types of reactors, because really at the end of the day, when you talk about reactor safety, you're talking about managing and containing radionuclides that are produced that could present a potential threat, right? If they got out or were released in a way and dispersed, right? The ways in which you typically are going to best do that is make sure you maintain integrity of the things that are containing those things, whether it be the cladding, whether it be the fuel itself, like a number of different barriers. You typically engineer a number of those in, so you have kind of what's known as defense in depth in place. And then what you can then to maintain that is you want to make sure the system is controlled, and it's great if it can be self-controlling. So if something happens, if you produce too much power, obviously you can overheat. That can be challenging. So you want to have a system that will shut itself down naturally. Is a really nice thing to be able to do. And then the other thing with nuclear is when you turn it off, you don't actually turn it off. This is one of those things that's kind of wild. But when you shut down a nuclear reactor, you're actually still producing heat. I like the term afterheat. The industry often calls it decay heat. But basically, the byproducts of fission itself are decaying away radioactively, and they're releasing a lot of energy, and much of which gets manifest as heat. So it has to be removed. Now, that heat makes up a small percentage of the total amount of power produced at a reactor at full power, but that needs to be managed. And it does decay away, which is great. But you have to be able to have a system that can cool and remove that heat. And that's typically been the biggest challenge in the headline events that you talked about. But you can accommodate and achieve that using natural phenomena as well. So to dig into that, the specific technology we're working on, a liquid sodium fast reactor, has shown that you can actually did this most notably at the plant in Idaho EBR2 that you talked about. In April 1986, they put this reactor through these incredible, challenging situations that would be catastrophic for most today's reactors by and large. And it survived them without, so much really a scratch. And the reason was because they had a system that was able to control itself naturally. As the reactor heated up, the fuel thermally expanded, and then that caused more neutrons to leak out of the fuel, get absorbed in the stuff around the fuel, and have the reactor shut itself down. And then on top of that, it also had sort of an interesting ability to just be able to cool itself naturally. In other words, the heat was naturally removed from the fuel by the natural circulation of the coolant, which then ultimately rejected its heat to air naturally. And that was also naturally flowing. What I mean by that is the coolant that flows between the fuel pins that's convectively removing heat. As it heats up, it thermally expands. That causes it to then rise, pull colder coolant behind it. So you're convectively able to remove heat that way, and you're able to flow a natural circulation because that hotter coolant rises. And in so doing, it's able to then transfer its heat through the vessel basically into just an air-cooled system that's also operating a natural convective phenomena where air heat rises along the surface, heats up, expands, gets less dense, and then buoyancy causes it to rise and pull cool air behind it, and you have this kind of open infinite loop almost. That means you have a system that's able to be self-stabilizing and self-cooling. And in 1986, what they showed was they had the reactor at full power. They turned off the pumps, which meant you have the significant mismatch between heat generation and heat removal, which would have caused the reactor to significantly overheat. It did heat up a bit, but shut itself down naturally, and then all those natural phenomena kicked in and cooled itself off. They went to lunch, they came back, turned the reactor back on, and then locked the control rods out again. That's the things that you would normally put into the reactor to shut it down, right? So you're basically handicapping yourself pretty considerably. And then they turned off power to the plant. Basically what happened at Fukushima, but way, way, way worse because Fukushima was shut down for an hour before they lost power. This thing was at full power and they lost power. And the reactor went through the same phenomenology, shut itself down naturally and cooled itself off without an issue, right? And that's phenomenal. Achievement that gives you incredible safety characteristics, but also translates economically in beneficial ways because it allows you to simplify the design and reduce cost accordingly. That's a pretty attractive thing to be able to do. And you could do that with a number of types of reactors. So I think that's a pretty important thing. And that's kind of where people call that in the industry passive and inherent safety. It's a pretty big focus, I think, for new reactor designs because of those benefits. But I also think there's something that's broadly becoming more aware for folks, getting back to what you said at the beginning, which is you're also benefiting just from public awareness. It turns out, and this is something that sometimes gets provocative, but like 3 Mile Island really wasn't that bad of a situation. All those safety systems that were there, well, most of them actually worked pretty well and contained things. The public didn't receive any unnecessarily large or dangerous doses of radiation. obviously the hype, the media headlines, the narrative, the active disinformation and misinformation campaigns by anti-nuclear special interest groups that often had backing and support from sort of competitive alternatives. Um, those like yeah, those found footing back in that time. It wasn't to their benefit when the internet came along. Silly as that sounds, but we live in the information age. People can actually access information and see through kind of the misinformation and disinformation campaigns that anti-nuclear folks have sowed across in many cases, the public's mindset about the dangers of nuclear. And what we've seen many, many times over and over again is as people dig in, they come up with and realize, wow, actually, like this is amazing technology. And even without these amazing advanced passive safety features that allow you to achieve phenomenal safety characteristics and maybe achieve them at lower cost, which is great for deployment and scalability, our current plants are phenomenally safe. One of the safest sources of energy generation there is, just full stop. And the data supports it. And so I think that alone is actually causing a significant amount of reset. Just people being able to go online and search this stuff and find out about it. And then you have people become pretty enthusiastic. And so I think you've seen a massive sea change there just because of the availability of information that corrects the false narratives that have existed about nuclear safety in the past.
This episode is brought to you by Chaser. Chaser is a task management solution completely embedded in Slack. When teammates have requests for each other, it's no longer necessary to involve a project manager, add the issues to a task tracker, and remember to follow up. Right from within any Slack channel or message, with a few simple keystrokes, you can identify a message as a task for another person or yourself, and Chaser automatically tracks it and reminds the assignee of the work until it's done. We started using Chaser at First Principles to create stronger clarity on those important but less formal tasks that must happen to get from start to finish on a project, but that often don't arise until the middle of a discussion. We now spend less time context switching, and we're not dropping the ball on each other. Plus, there's great transparency into who does what in order to bring the team to success. Get a 14-day free trial at www.trychaser.com and use the code FP50 to get 50% off your first 3 months. Yeah, I think there's also, forgive me for this sort of ludicrous comparison, but I think that for a long time, people didn't have a conception of what benefit that they would directly derive from nuclear power, other than like, I don't know, maybe I pay a few extra or a few fewer cents on my energy bill if I have nuclear power in my backyard. Now people can see ChatGPT, they can see Claude, they can see Gemini, they can see these models impacting their lives. And so there's almost this pull that's like, well, we know we're going to need more energy for that. So we're willing to maybe reconsider some of the technologies that from a public opinion perspective, it's not the public making the decisions in a direct fashion, but I think there's something to that. Let me probe a little bit deeper though on this. So I came across this term. I think this is what you were explaining. Tell me if this is wrong. Were you talking about the negative temperature coefficient of reactivity? Is that the concept
Yes.
that you were describing? Okay.
Yeah.
And is the idea basically that as the reaction gets too hot, the efficiency at which neutrons bombard each other to continue the chain reaction basically becomes lower? And so the reaction is is effectively cooling itself down. Am I getting that right or not quite?
Not quite. What it really is as the reactor heats up, you get the fuel end up pushing itself further apart from itself. In other words, fuel atoms become more distant from each other, which means the likelihood of neutrons actually interacting with fuel atoms becomes lower, which then means you're just having less fission events occur, which means you're producing less neutrons and less power. And as a result, you get this cascading benefit of shutting the reactor down that way.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. If that's the case, then what keeps the reaction going when you're not introducing a loss of power, not stopping the control rods, not removing coolant or somehow impeding coolant? Like, what keeps the reaction moving?
Yeah. So what that really looks like is uh like you keep it, so you design it to be sort of operationally stable at the steady state conditions you expect it to operate at, so that you're able to be operating, producing power. The reactor is considered critical. What that term really refers to is it's a steady state of producing basically as many neutrons from one generation to the next. So you're not getting growth or really decline in neutron population, and that translates to then steady state of power production, because neutron population is dependent on power production, because power is manifest by fission, and fission is what releases the neutrons, right? So when you split an atom, not only do you release that energy, but you release 2 or 3 neutrons pretty much every time. So the number of neutrons produced is dependent on the number of fission events happening, which directly translates to, is the amount of power being produced. And so as the system's operating at a kind of a steady state, you're at this level of just producing, X amount of power. This is one of the really cool things about kind of then what you can do with this, because it's load following, meaning like if you change how much power you're pulling out of the system, like electric power, you can actually then just have the reactor naturally stabilize, because if you're removing less heat than's being produced, or reduce the amount of heat you're pulling off the system through like boiling water and spinning a turbine and converting that to electricity, the reactor will heat up because you're pulling less power, and that will cause the fuel to expand and then re-equilibrate, but at a lower power. And then the inverse is true too. If you're operating at a steady state, you end up pulling more power out of the reactor. You actually end up causing the fuel and the reactor to cool down a little bit, and then as a result, produce more power as it then re-equilibrates into that new regime. So it's a very elegant system that gives you this natural feedback phenomena. One of the other extrapolations is then, okay, well, if you have an event that happens where the reactor's like, it goes through one of these events you talked about, and then it shuts itself down naturally because something happened and overheats, eventually that's going to cool down enough because the decay heat decays away. And so the system's actually going to cool back down to the point where the reactor could restart again, just albeit at a very low level of power, because the power will ultimately be dependent on what you can remove through the natural phenomena at play. And that's true, right? And then what would happen there if nobody intervened or shut the reactor down and addressed whatever situation it was through the control rods, it would just naturally sort of turn on and turn off and turn on and turn off until it ultimately depleted its fuel and just coast down, right? So it's just a long coast down, effectively, is what would happen. So anyway, that's kind of an extrapolation, but does that kind of answer the question? Sorry to
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
drive.
absolutely. And so have other companies been building reactors that follow this design pattern? I know we haven't had a lot of new nuclear reactors other than the one in Georgia. Um,
Yeah.
are they doing this?
I mean, the degree of what has been demonstrated and what was demonstrated with this EBR2 reactor, and also it had a cousin plant in Washington State called FFTF that demonstrated similar phenomena, like that's pretty unrivaled. But you can achieve similar capabilities with water-cooled systems or even with gas-cooled systems. Slightly different physics of what drive things. Like it's not just the fuel being spaced further apart, it's also changing sort of the ratio of fuel to other materials that slow neutrons down. We don't have that in a fast reactor. It's very, very tightly coupled system. I know kind of in the technical weeds, but this trend line of having the putting physics on your side, things like gravity, like thermal conduction, like thermal convection, those have been employed even in those reactors we built in Georgia, and they're being employed with some of these designs like we're bringing forward and some others are building out from. This is definitely the new era. I sometimes like to think of nuclear technology having gone through kind of three macro sort of design evolutions that span decades each, or design epochs maybe. One epoch was like the initial one was like just making it work, right? That was kind of the 40s into the 50s. Then I think from the 50s until really probably the 70s, 80s, it was about, to me, and this is just my view, right? But like, it was about maximizing power density out of the fuel. It's one of the amazing things about nuclear is you can generate a ton of power in a small volume. And so that became pretty exciting for people to do. But the problem with that was the implications it had on the rest of the system, because when you maximize power density, it becomes a lot harder to achieve all those amazing inherent and passive safety features. And you end up having to bolt on all these systems, backup systems, auxiliary systems, to keep the system cooled and all these other
It's
things
almost
you need
too
to have happen.
greedy. Yeah.
It becomes, yeah, and it becomes complex at the system level, increasingly
Mhm.
complex. And I think where we started in the 80s forward was recognizing actually it's really great if we sort of change the equation of maximizing fuel power density at the fuel level and actually maximize power density at sort of the plant level that affords you these like naturally simplified sort of, I guess, features or design characteristics, so that you're able to just now be able to, how much power can I get out of a system that just is able to cool itself naturally by airflow around the vessel or whatever sort of design you're pursuing. And then that induces, that lines itself also typically towards smaller reactor designs, which then gives you benefits though, because now you also get rid of all of these backup and auxiliary systems because you don't need them. And that comes with great benefits, right? And it's that piece that I think sometimes people forget about because it kind of gets lost in the academic origination of this. And that motivation kind of was manifest more in the 80s. Now we're seeing the fruits of that labor though. And I think yeah, so we're not the only ones designing a system that can do stuff like this. In fact, pretty much everything that's being explored has quite similar flavors to this. We just love that we're building out a technology that actually demonstrated it with a real machine, with a real reactor. And that's pretty
Yeah.
unique.
It reminds me a little bit of the Waymo founder was on a podcast recently talking about how the biggest limiting factor for them is actually trust. They could roll out in more cities, but they want to build trust. And I think in an interesting way, by having a generation of reactors where we're not running the reactors at 11 all the time instead of at 8 or 9, there's a chance to actually build that trust with a high volume of more modular reactors, show
Sure.
people this actually works, show them that it solves their needs. Um, okay, so let me ask you this question. So because you guys are running fast fission reactors, you are taking in a wider range of fuel isotopes in the first place. Um, does this also mean that you're producing more radioactive byproducts at the end of your reactions? And does this also mean that it's more complicated to build your fuel rods in a safe fashion in the first place? Can you talk a little bit about that side of things?
So with a fast reactor, one of the things you can really, what's cool about it is the ability to actually use a lot of different fuel sources. And the simplified nuclear physics explanation for that is the neutrons themselves in a fast reactor are going fast. So when you split an atom, the neutrons that are emitted are typically, well, they're almost all born going really fast. Um, you can design a reactor that slows them down by bouncing them off certain lightweight elements like hydrogen and water or carbon and graphite, and that will slow them down, makes them easier to catch and absorb, but that ends up coming with significant penalties on what you can actually fission and how immune you are to being intercepted by either material types, material impurities, or even the byproducts of fission themselves. That really limits how much energy ultimately you can get out of fuel in any what's called slow neutron or thermal neutron reactor. Fast neutron reactor doesn't have those moderating elements or materials that slow neutrons down. So the neutrons just go as they're born. They inherently slow down a little bit just because they bounce off non-fuel materials. But at the end of the day, like they're going quite fast. And because they're going quite fast, they carry quite a bit of energy that allows them to now fission things quite effectively. It's a bit of a distraction because it's not quite the same exact thing. But like in our reactor, almost 15% of the power comes from the direct fission of uranium-238, which is really not very well directly fissionable at all. And in a thermal reactor, you only get a couple percent at most. And so that's just kind of an example that you can start to fission things much more effectively. But what that really translates though to is the efficacy of fissioning all of the things that build up in a reactor because of all those neutrons that do end up colliding with uranium-238, but mostly don't fission, instead get absorbed, transmuting that uranium into other elements that we call transuranics, like neptunium, americium, plutonium, curium, curium, so on and so forth. Most of which, pretty much all of which, can be pretty efficiently fissioned in a fast reactor. So that means you can recycle fuel, frankly, and that's what's cool about this. There are other benefits. Being a fast reactor means you're impervious to like the negative effects of different coolants and material types. So you can use cheaper, more abundant materials or better coolants like sodium. All those things have benefits that way. But you need more fuel to start. That's the big downside. In terms of then like the heat and sort of radioactive signatures of that fuel you make using those transuranics. And just to be clear, you can design a fast reactor that runs on fresh fuel or on recycled fuel or on all sorts of different things. That's the flexibility that's worth so much. And being able to run on the transuranics, that's key to actually recycling fuel. But what that comes with is you are dealing with these transuranics that are, generally speaking, much more radioactive than uranium and therefore usually produce more heat and radiation. So you end up fabricating that fuel in more controlled environments, whether glove boxes or hot cells. But this has been done before. We know how to do this. And then you're put in a reactor, which is way more radioactive than like the fuel is itself. So you kind of obviates that. But what you're actually doing though, what's cool is those transuranics, part of the challenge they introduced on used fuel management, if you just leave them in the fuel, because all reactors produce these, right? Like in today's waste out of today's reactors, about 2 to 3% of the atoms in there are transuranics, some less, some more, depending on how long that fuel is in the reactor. About 3 to 5% are fission products, and then the rest is the unused uranium. And so in recycling, you can take that uranium out and you can keep reusing it. The fission products mostly get thrown away for disposal, although some can actually be used for certain industrial or medical purposes. And those things are typically short-lived. On average, their half-life is about 30 years. Some are longer, some are shorter. But then the transuranics, those are the things that actually have dictated a lot of the long duration challenges of how do we manage used fuel, because they typically have half-lives on the tens of thousands of years. So they're around a lot longer. Now they're less radioactive because the shorter half-life, the more radioactive you are, the longer half-life, the less radioactive you are. But because you have enough of it and it lasts that long, it dictates long duration timeframes for how to consider these things. Well, in a fast reactor with recycling, what you do is you just take those transuranics, put them back in and fission them. So you're taking something that's otherwise around for hundreds of thousands of years and converting it to something that's around for hundreds to 1,000 years. and getting all this energy out is benefit. So it's tremendously useful. And just to put a number on the actual value of this, like used fuel, there's enough energy content in today's used fuel in the United States, of which there's like 90,000 metric tons or so, all of which in volume, by the way, would fit in something the size of a super Walmart, which for coastal listeners may sound foreign, but for those of us who've ever been to big super Walmarts, we can appreciate they're big, but they're not that big. But all of that used fuel, which has only been about 5% used, there's enough energy content in that 95% of unused fuel to power the entire country's electric energy needs for 150 years. And every year our plants are discharging enough waste or used fuel to power the country for 4 years, right? So like this is a nearly inexhaustible resource. At scale, eventually we consume through all these things and even outpace the rate of production. And then you just be pulling in heavy metals from stuff that's been discarded out and through enrichment and through mining, and eventually through, how you do it probably from like seawater harvesting. But at this point, we're talking about 1,000+ year time frames from now. And then you transition into a fully closed fuel cycle, which is really awesome. I mean, sorry, it doesn't take that long to transition to that, but like you're operating in this world where really all you're putting into the system is either uranium or thorium out of the ground, and you're able to then produce all this amazing energy from this, and you just keep recycling what's unused from the actinide perspective and getting rid of the fission products, the leftovers on that front. You can only do that with fast reactors, and that's when I talked about right at the beginning a terminal energy climate solution. That's how you then unlock a fuel resource that we know how to access in this planet for billions of years without carbon, like without greenhouse emissions. They're pretty damn cool, right? Like that mission is what gets us excited. Yeah.
It's stunning. And just for everyone's benefit, transuranics are the material, are the elements that are produced out of nuclear reactors that are larger than uranium, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So the stuff at the bottom of the periodic table to the right, I use this so much. I need to have my nice little like periodic table card, but the things like neptunium and plutonium and americium and curium, things like
The
that.
stuff you're not going to find just walking around in the wilderness.
No,
Only from
no.
the lab.
Yeah, stuff that doesn't exist really naturally. So,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, yeah.
No, that's great. So let's talk about data centers and GPUs. Obviously, I feel like I actually feel bad asking you this question because you guys have been at it so long that your all of your work predates this latest round of excitement. But of course, this latest round of excitement is still very real. And we know that GPUs are essential for all of the large language models and for that additional compute. And demand is accelerating massively to meet these needs. How is Oklo poised to ride this wave? And why would companies like Microsoft want to reopen parts of 3 Mile Island, instead of putting down a contract for a couple of new Auroras?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple way here, I look at this in two fronts, right? One, we've learned and we continue to learn that um, AI just uses a lot more energy than like what we've typically seen from a compute perspective. And with that comes the great power and capabilities of AI. So that's going to, as we see AI continue, deployment and adoption, it is going to just drive up energy usage. And I think we're fortunate. The chair of our board from almost the beginning of the company has been Sam Altman, who probably knows more about this than maybe anybody. But he has very clearly, articulated that like abundant intelligence comes from abundant energy. And so driving those together is a pretty key dependency, right, to build off of. And I think the other way to look at this is then like to do that, people also realize like we should probably be sustainable and how we can be sustainable. And also typically these things are going to be assets from the data center side and from the chips that you want to be running with as much uptime as you can, which lends itself to wanting a 24/7 power solution that's also sustainable and clean. And nuclear fits that bill. And so, I think we're well positioned because we can bring new generation in a way that can be co-located or adjacently located to data centers and provide power in pretty productive ways through either, on sort of in front of the meter on grid generation, adjacently located that reduce transmission stress, to behind the meter, co-located or adjacently located, or some hybrid edge role, or even fully islanded. And our size really lends itself to that. We offer a 15 and a 50 megawatt system. Same general footprint, just less fuel and more fuel. I know that sounds a little simple, and that does mean you have economic inefficiencies on a 15 megawatt, but we see most of our order book pushing on the 50 megawatt. And it creates a tremendous, amount of opportunity that way, to basically meet their needs in incremental ways, because a lot of data centers, their sort of architecture, if you will, is on like the data hall basis today. It seems to be around that 50 megawatt or so sweet spot. So maybe a data center has multiple of those, but they build those up in phases. And so that means we can build the reactors out in phases and match their power needs. And we're small enough that we can offer an N+1 power solution. In other words, you need to overbuild to make sure that you have power in case you need to take a system offline. If you're building a really big plant and you build a second really big plant, that's a pretty tough thing to manage because you have a lot of stranded power that you're just having sit on standby. If you're building a couple small plants, it's easy to add that incremental N+1 and N+2 to have that kind of reliability. So we're really well positioned for that. But we can't bring, unfortunately, much new power to anybody before really 2028, 2029, right? I mean, we have our first project going before that, but that's just one reactor. As we look at scale beyond that, then yeah, we can start meeting power needs. But between now and then, there's a big crunch, right? And people are trying to find where they can get powered. One of the things that's emerged is, I think, the nuclear assets that we have today, especially in certain markets where we've had radically distorted market policies. Let me rephrase it, radically distorting market policies, like in the PJM grid, that we're not recognizing the value of what nuclear kind of generated electrons were, especially from a baseload perspective. You see people saying, all right, I need this power for my data center. I can't get it from the grid really. And because of those not just because, but partly because of those market distorting policies, it's worth this to me. Hey, nuclear plant, I'll pay you this. Does that work for you? And then, the nuclear plant's like, yeah, that's great. I'm getting value for what I actually do for the first time, maybe in a while. And so they're moving in that direction. And it's enough so that then where you have some of these plants that have been shut down, they're going to restart them. And that's pretty awesome. Now, there's not many that can do that, but there are a couple. And that's pretty amazing because you're bringing big chunks of power back online. And I wish there were more, and maybe that will help unlock even more that right now are considered maybe a little too hard to do that. But I do think there's a significant amount of potential there. And then going back, honestly, just to my PhD days, the research was on making big reactors bigger. And I think we'll see a little bit of that, probably find some landing grab too. But that definitely provides you the solutions for the next couple of years. But no matter what, you're going to need a lot of new generation. And maybe the best example of this is today, when we record this, we announced that we signed a 12 gigawatt power supply partnership agreement with Switch data centers. Huge number, right?
Yeah, massive increase.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal opportunity. As I like to also refer to it, it's just about enough power to drive 5 round trips back to the future, right? 1.21 gigawatts, 12 gigawatts. I love that. But anyway,
Excellent.
but yeah, seriously, it's a massive opportunity, and it just reflects what people are seeing as the demand growth for this. And obviously, like, AI's got a lot of attention right now, but it's not just AI. We have reshoring the manufacturing base, which needs steady power. We have electrification driving a massive increase in power usage. Having gone through that now, and every house I've lived in the last 10 years of needing to upgrade the electrical service or the panel, like it's just because that's where we're moving to, right? And so
But
you
I
need the
think
power
you're
to support
onto
that.
something as well. I was going to ask you a whole question about how you guys decided on on smaller modular reactors, but I feel like you've already started to answer it. But I want to push on this a little bit. Are you basically seeing that the use cases for new power consumption, sort of modern new use cases for power consumption, like data centers, are actually more modular in terms of how the company that's using the power is building their stuff? Like, are you seeing, for example, with Switch, that it's going to be lots and lots of smaller, not, maybe small compared to massive data centers, as opposed to like just a couple of giant ones? Or is it going to be one giant data center surrounded by like 15 Auroras, Like, are you seeing something in the market that's giving you that confidence?
We're finding, right, a kind of testament with the partnerships we've announced, but our sizing matches very well with the incremental growth at these a lot of the data center development like level efforts. There's definitely gonna be room for gigawatt scale projects and plants, especially when you're looking at things being built on grid and generalized purposes and generalized locations. But because in so many places they're being told to bring their own power, we offer kind of a very well suited outcome or solution for them to do that for data center developers, where we can say, okay, you're bringing your own power to this area, you need that. Great, we can provide that. And then we can go co-locate with them. And then our size works to match with their growth plans. And this is the other important thing. AI demand looks almost limitless in some ways today. It's mind-bogglingly large. If there's dynamics around that taking more time to accrue, because also the other thing here is we're getting more and more understanding. So we have some reasonably decent understandings of how large language model training uses power, but how AI usage and deployment actually uses power is still seems to be evolving rapidly. In other words, like what the actual usability, the inference, all this kind of stuff that's happening is changing that dynamic. And even if you shift compute more like edge of, or even on device, like, which, yeah, cool, that's going to happen. You still got to drive power to those devices. So like, you're just going to see like a lot of things that are moving in terms of constructive power level demand. But if there is any kind of changes, in a data center may have a plan to get to a gigawatt of total usage. If they have a hard time selling that, maybe they sell half of that capacity in phases. We can build up with them, and then they can move that other half where it's going to go. I mean, when I say they may have a hard time, I just mean it may take a little longer. What's great about that is that means we're not building assets that are sitting on a bunch of stranded power. So actually being smaller helps you go bigger, which I know that sounds silly, but like that is true because of
Makes
the
sense.
natural deployment, like modularity of data centers and accordingly what you want from the power side.
This episode is brought to you by Tonic AI. Tonic intelligently transforms your sensitive production data into realistic test data that's safe to use across your lower environments to accelerate your engineering velocity while safeguarding data privacy. We've all experienced the pain and wasted cost of building features with unrealistic data in staging your development environments. Mismatches between prod and test data lead to costly bugs in production, poor user experience, and when it comes to RAG or LLM applications, even incorrect answers. Moreover, as the data scale increases, it becomes difficult for developers to test their features with high fidelity. Tonic's products streamline data synthesis, subsetting, and provisioning to get developers the realistic data they need when and where they need it. Get on-demand access to safe, high-fidelity versions of your structured, semi-structured, or free text data to shorten sprints, catch more bugs, and ship better products faster. Visit tonic.ai/emergent to learn more and receive 15% off in your first year. All this stuff sounds amazing, almost too good to be true. Like, what are some of the hardest technologies that you guys have had to build at Oklo to make Aurora a reality? Or maybe what are some of the early stumbling blocks that you guys made and ultimately corrected in your strategy that you can tell us about?
I think one thing we misunderstood. I mean, hindsight's 2020. I would have moved recycling to move faster because we saw where the order books have gone, but we didn't know that. Our model was always don't do recycling reactors together. It's too much. Don't do recycling first because what do you do with it? Do reactors first. Figure out then build an order book that then you have to fuel those reactors, which then pulls recycling behind it. But that all ended up happening in a bit faster way. So that's cool for us. But now we got to now you got to kind of rush that piece. When I say rush, that's the wrong word, but we want to accelerate that as much as we can. And in hindsight, I would have moved some of that activity sooner, faster, and earlier. In some ways, I think optically, we would have probably changed how we approach some of the regulatory stuff. We got really aggressive on some things, leaned hard into it, tried some really new things, found a lot of receptiveness from the NRC on it, but ultimately got kind of waylaid by the pandemic, changing review plans and times and dynamics because we couldn't do all this stuff in person we planned to do. That optically was not great for us, but practically speaking, it was great. So I don't know if I would change it. But it optically would have probably made some of our life easier and gave us a few more, restful nights had we done that a little differently. But then again, I think that also is kind of goes to something that I'm pretty hard against, which is kowtowing and catering to kind of like investor driven optics, which I think from a venture perspective are generally speaking pretty misaligned with hard tech. And then I think additionally, like we saw a lot of, I think we would have probably done a little bit differently on the market discovery side for sizing a little sooner. But at the same time, we're here now, and that's where things are. Like we couldn't have seen all of this coming because nobody had this coming. Like compute density was way lower, data center architectures were way smaller just 2-3 years ago when we were doing that stuff. And so I don't think it would have been that much different had we done that a little earlier. But I think that that said, you can never talk to customers probably too early. You can never get a sense of doing those things kind of, I think, early on to help inform product. So it's probably like a thing I would point to.
Do you guys have a product team or product managers? Like, how have you guys managed that inside your organization? I know a lot of emerging tech companies do not.
It's funny. Yeah, we do actually. Sort of like on the executive side, it kind of runs our engineering and regulatory side is actually a chief of product is the title. Because for our views, we like, and this is actually early in the days of when we moved the company from Cambridge, Massachusetts to the Bay Area. Wasn't just because of the weather, but partly because we wanted a cultural shift. Because like being in Massachusetts, knowing we recruit a lot of folks from MIT, probably it's really easy to kind of stay as an academically oriented entity. This is not a research company. This is a product company. So kind of moving out here was a helpful focus. So we've long had that focus, and it's pretty imbued in the culture. I actually think if you don't do that, you really end up missing what you're trying to do. Like And this is where it's so hard. It is harder if you're doing hard tech that has fundamental research requirements to it. I understand why people do that, but man, it's so much. It is a different world in some cases. If you cannot do that and you can pick up on what's been done before, holy cow, does that make things a lot easier? Um,
What is the stuff that the engineers at Oklo are staying up at night toiling with? You know, those sort of like forever problems where you chip away at it, you make progress, but you never really solve it. Where the product people don't really have a role to play in it, but it is critical to the business. What are some of those challenges?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting transition point across, the whole design trade-off space that reflects at different size levels of power. Like our view is never you just stop at 15 and 50. There's always been kind of to get bigger, and there's natural inflection points that start to push you away from the small prefabricated modular benefits to becoming a giga project, and you want to kind of avoid the giga project, or I should say mega project, but maybe, anyway, that you kind of want to avoid that dynamic because you start to lose those benefits pretty quickly. So we like the idea of trying to stay in those ranges, and we've looking at how actually those things, what those trade off kind of induced inflection points are from a design perspective, informed by actual supply chain dynamics. Like that's a constantly moving set of variables. So I think that's the thing that keeps the engineering team sort of awake and alert at night. Designing then in as well, like yeah, all the power targets have been interesting as data centers have increased in size. I mean, that's driven us to try to keep up in certain areas, and we should do some things to make sure we're preserving some upside in the system so that we can also expand if we so need. That's pretty normal for reactor design, but keeping that's important. And then I think the other is like, okay, like how do you best include the capabilities to develop and transition to better technologies that you do want to include, like different cladding materials. That's the stuff that goes around the fuel, like steel tubes. There are a number of materials you can use for that, and some of which are not very mature. Well, let me phrase that. There's a number of materials you can use commercially today. Some are less commercially available, but probably better to use. And then there's ones that are not yet fully developed from a research and development perspective, but have immense promise on all fronts. So wanting to get to those and accelerate to those as quickly as possible. And I think that's one of those things where there's a set of moving variables too. So, I think those are things where you just end up having to lock something based on what you understand on pieces are. You end up leaving some stuff on the table. I think generally speaking, it's better to leave some stuff on the table than try to take it all in and maybe overextend a little bit. If you like design for a little extra size that really pushes you on the edge of what you can do for like one system design capacity point without transitioning to slightly more exotic requirements or specs, like it's better to have more margin against that than less. So I think that biases us to be a little bit smaller, but I think what engineers like to know is what those cutoff points are with increasing fidelity. And that is always a moving bogey too. Right. So I think that's kind of what we think about and spend time on.
To get to this point, obviously, you've had to do a lot with the regulators. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've set up your regulatory team, what specialties are on the team, the size of the team, and what are the regulators actually asking you other than, have you specifically met, points 1 through 100?
Yeah. So like the regulatory engagement is largely kind of distilled, I think, most effectively into communicating what the design looks like, how it works, and how to analyze it, and then how you then do all that to meet regulatory requirements and compliance. That's kind of how I think what the engagement looks like. And there's inherently things that are different with a system of our size and type than what they're used to from a process perspective. So a lot of that engagement has just been around process translation, but also, training on the technology and then also iterating on the approaches of regulatory like compliance, basically. Um, and that starts with like a lot of fundamental, like we didn't do what others had typically done, which is go in and say, all right, we're going to try to make this as easy to understand to you, the regulators, possible by licensing it like it was something it's not, because that has been a tripping point. I've seen that happen in the past, and that ends up getting you into this square peg round hole kind of situation. It's better to say, hey, these are the innate inherent features of the system. These are the physics of the system. Start from there. Once we all kind of are caught up and on the same page with that, then we can talk about what actually drives the safety case, and therefore then the regulatory requirements, how we meet them. And that was a more aggressive stance. And we started leaning in very aggressively so we could shake loose some of the perspectives that would be easier to fall back into, which for a regulator is just more natural to do. And then we were able to kind of lean into that. I think some people judge us pretty hard still, like, well, Oklo just was too aggressive, or they were naive, or they were, doing all stuff. It's like, yeah, 100% we were leaning hard, and we were also being like
But
pretty like,
this is because you guys had like that one denial a couple years ago
yeah,
that you then rectified. Like that doesn't even that seems like a speed bump, not a
yeah, well,
mistake per
that's the
se.
thing. That's it, right? So for an industry that's been stagnant and dead for so long, it's like, "Oh my god, this is unbelievable," and it's a very toxic culture in the industry. Then, compared to outside, it's like, "Oh, okay, yeah, what's next?" I remember talking to some of our folks on kind of the customer side who were like, "Yeah, we think there's something wrong. You weren't doing it. You were being way too, like, cautious, and you were doing something wrong if you didn't get some speed bumps like that, because anytime you're doing permitting, you're gonna find some pushback, otherwise you're not pushing hard enough." And I think that's a big thing that to me is like, yeah, and I love that you said it like that, 'cause I mean, it sucked and it was annoying and it was hard to understand by other people, so, I mean, it was hard to communicate in ways, but look, like, we're better for it. It forced us to get smarter and better in certain areas, and it also drove the NRC forward in certain areas.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I looked at it for the podcast in case there was some juicy meat there, but basically, what my conclusion was maybe there was just a little bit of a miscommunication. Everybody figured out what everybody was saying, and now we're all good. So it's not like, oh, there's some massive solved risk or something like that. It's just a matter of figuring out how to communicate. I kind of like
See,
that you sort of described it as almost like it's almost like part PR and educational. And then it's also part, the process of like going back and forth, answering the questions, filling out the documents. It's not faceless for you guys, right? Like you fill out a bunch of documents. We actually meet people on a regular basis. You talk to them.
all the
There's back
time,
and forth. Yeah. Okay.
all the time.
Very
Yeah.
interesting. Cool. Because a lot of the other emerging tech companies that are listening, they have their own regulators that are maybe not quite as challenging as the NRC, but they've got them. So it's always
Yeah.
helpful for them to hear that.
I think that's the thing is like, you gotta kinda like you gotta embrace the fear of the regulator.
Okay, so look, there is a lot of competition in this space. Bill Gates, Westinghouse, General Atomics, Founders Fund has a portfolio company doing reactors. What does it take to stay ahead in this particular market?
Yeah, I mean, I think first the opportunity space is so big that there's gonna be a lot of success. So that I think is important, right? It's just too big. And that's a great thing for everybody. In terms of us, like I think this is where right, like a first principle alignment, a product centered view, a business model that's differentiated from what others are doing, the order book we've had, and the timing advantages, just like all of those kind of accrue in a very constructive way. We're the only company that has fuel awarded to us for any of these kinds of things. That's a great spot to be. There's not a lot of that right now. It's getting
Wait,
spun up,
sorry,
but
what do you mean? I read that, but what does that mean, fuel awarded? So you can't just go buy it because the government heavily regulates it. So is
well,
that basically what's happening?
it's really just that the supply chain kind of stagnated and languished, and it's been growing in this side. So, what happened was, we basically just don't have quite the level of enrichment capacity in this country that we used to have. We've been
Hmm.
importing about 18% of that from Russia. That's going away. So we're now going through this reinvigoration. But that meant that there was an extra capacity, really, and specifically capacity to make kind of the more specialized form of fuel that like most advanced reactors use, called high assay low enriched uranium, which is still low enriched but above what today's plants use. So there's one company that started producing it commercially a year ago, but in small quantities. We're partnered with them. That's great. But before all of that, 5 years ago, we were awarded fuel from Idaho National Laboratory in the Department of Energy, and we're the only company that has that. Now that supply chain is catching up, but we locked ourselves in and have a huge head start because of that. It also gives us the ability then to work with the other suppliers, to get fuel from them and kind of grow with them. Then on top of that, we have a site use permit. We're the only company that has that at a national lab. So we're the only company that has site, fuel, and also the regulatory traction we have for a commercial power plant. Couple that then with the order book we have, like it's a pretty compelling position to have. So, we feel pretty good about that, but it's also fully recognized that the market is pretty big and we fully expect others to be successful and hope others are successful. One of the things that actually annoys us the most is when others don't swing aggressively on doing things. I'd rather people do that. And instead of trying to snipe around the like, oh, well, you know, we're taking a more cautious approach. And so that's better. It's like, no, 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 no. Like run to your risk tolerance, but like you should try to be doing things more aggressively, because the more we do it together, the more we're going to get good outcomes faster from, especially on the regulatory side, but also just on like, supply chain development and everything else.
That's a super healthy way of looking at competition. I love that. So, huge part of building any novel hardware is obviously manufacturing at scale. I know you guys are probably a little early on this, but some CEOs even argue that this is the hardest part about building a successful hardware company. Are there some lessons that are guiding how Oklo is currently approaching the manufacturing or thinking about approaching it in the future for such specialized technology?
This is a great thing. Doesn't need to be specialized. Avoid the traps.
Hmm.
SpaceX, I didn't work there, so I'm just paraphrasing what people on our team have said about it. Like, look, they did it because they had to. You can't go buy rocket parts from other industries. Like, that's very specialized. Nuclear doesn't need to be that. It can be. You absolutely can be. You see other people doing it that way. It doesn't need to be. So we actually intentionally designed to the supply chain to leverage out everything we have to do. The only thing we really have to take in-house early on is fuel fabrication. And so we partnered aggressively with the national laboratories to do that. And that's how we've approached getting that off the ground. And then you're doing something that's also been done before. So you're just applying best lessons or best capabilities with existing facilities to try to get that to happen as capital efficiently and quickly as possible to then scale and iterate on. So something you don't have to do in nuclear. Sometimes people do it, but I think it's not the greatest decision at all.
I love that. I love that. One of the unique attributes of your company's corporate side is that you guys did recently go public via SPAC, specifically with Alt C. Can you explain how you made that decision? And what are the circumstances that you'd recommend a similar path to other companies? When would you not recommend that path to other companies?
What we saw was we long need to be public. We own and operate the assets. We sell the power. Like project finance is an important tool for us, and being public just unlocks that. I do think that having the right timing and structure and the right partnership to make that align towards long-term perspectives, which is what we structured in our deal, is really important. It's really easy to spend time chasing something in a not as productive way in terms of a go public to kind of exit. We didn't want to do that. This was just a transitional fundraising step that allowed us to raise capital, get access to public markets for future capital financing, and that was a good spot to be for the business, and it made sense. I also think in parallel, I think so for some hard tech, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially ones where the market's understood and the technology risk is largely off the table. Like, I think if you have fundamental risks like those things, it's harder, right? And that's a trickier thing to look at going public in. But that's kind of how we see it. So I actually think it's really important. And I do think that that vehicle, SPACs and just being able to go public for hard tech companies that are pre-revenue is a really important sort of growth and financing mechanism. And oddly enough, going public has its own issues and distractions and risks and all that, but I actually think it gets you into a better spot to be able to execute compared to being in the private side at certain points for certain companies. At the end of the day, especially when you have kind of tight VC markets, you see a regression of being risk on from the venture markets. And then you see kind of a laziness on, I would say, diligence. And therefore, you kind of just don't see the right structured incentives or let me rephrase that, aligned incentives. And I just think that gets in the way for our tech founders and actually becomes a big negative distraction for them. But I do think being in the public market actually gives you a different level of access. And the level of savviness in the public markets is just much higher, which is great because it keeps you focused and forced on. It's been actually refreshing as opposed to kind of being in the very simplistic reductionist space that typical venture looks at hard tech. That's not a core focus for them. I think with time, you'll see more and more hard tech get smarter on this, but what we see is laughable still in terms of the level of comprehensiveness of understanding of diligence. And it's a lot more just built around pattern hacking and, momentum writing rather than actual fundamental conviction driven investments.
Yeah, it's sort of, you're saying it's a mechanism to achieve certain things as opposed to a destination, which is I think how a lot of companies think of going public. So that makes a lot of sense.
That's the better way to put it for sure. Yeah.
The Aurora design is amazing. It's beautiful. It's a pleasing geometric shape, sort of minimalist factor going on. You never see this from emerging tech companies. Like, design is always the last thing considered. How'd you guys decide to make it so beautiful? Like, where did that come from?
I think this is one of those things that goes back to the origination of the company. We really, really wanted to change how people think about nuclear and see it. So looking at it from a different aesthetic perspective is super important. So, that was a big thing, right? So functionally important. There's some aspects from the actual construction and civil side of this, which is great. The other big benefit is what we could do with respect to then the aesthetic aspects. We really wanted this to be something that looks different than the sort of distant, brutalistic concrete architecture people are used to in a nuclear system. We wanted it to be something that's more inviting, that actually feels cozy, like an atrium kind of embodies those things. So we went after that stylized approach on design. And I think it makes a big difference. I just think it's important for technology's form factor, especially when it feels different or distant or new or harder to fully understand. Making it appealing and attractive to people is, I think, a really important feature. This is something that, I've heard Sam talk about, actually, that we've heard Apple talk about. There's a lot of features that come from doing that the right ways. Something we really care about.
I love it. What's coming next for the company? How can people get in touch? Where do they go if they want to buy power?
Yeah, check out our website. It gives you all the directions if you're interested in buying power, if you're interested in learning more about the company. Obviously, we're a publicly traded company. The other part then is like, in terms of what's next, it's an exciting year ahead. Obviously, we have some pretty big announcements about where we're at with the product side and the sort of market side. We're also looking at what we need to do to get to the, like there's going to be further development there, but then also further execution on supply chain and on regulatory. And then, diversifying some of the things we're doing in the space, including kind of picking up some pretty exciting opportunities with an acquisition in a company in the medical radioisotope and also sort of industrial and defense radioisotope space. So that's going to open the door for some additional, I think, kind of cool watch points. So just continued execution with customers, project deployment, supply chain, siting, regulatory, and then building ultimately.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, Jake. Fascinating conversation.
I love it. It's awesome. It'd be fun to do another one if you want to dig deeper.
All right, let's do it. All right, take care. Thank you so much for listening. Emergent is brought to you by First Principles, where we provide emerging technology product coaching and fractional product leadership to founders with bold visions. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please consider leaving a review or sharing feedback directly with us. You can always find previous episodes, show notes, and more content on www.emergentproduct.com.